Good morning, Wabash. Speaking today at Pioneer Chapel will be Father Michael Bauer with his talk titled, A Call for a Return to Authentic Masculinity. Father Bauer is the pastor of St. Bernard Catholic Church and chaplain of the Wabash College Newman Center. He holds degrees from the University of St. Thomas, Christendom College, and St. Myriad's Seminary in Southern Indiana. As pastor to St. Bernard and chaplain to the Newman Center, Father Bauer ministers to a diverse congregation that includes farmers, professionals, teachers, Hispanics, youth, and of course, the men of Wabash College. Let's give a warm welcome to Father Bauer.
Good morning, Wabash. I'd like to thank the Sphinx Club for inviting me to speak today, and all of you who made the time to be here. This is my 5th year as chaplain of the Newman Center, and I consider it a great privilege and an honor to be here. Do we have any members of the Newman Club who are here present? All right. What about the Wabash Christian men? All right. Excellent. It's good to have you men here. It's been great to work with you over the last few years. I've greatly enjoyed my time working with these clubs, and even though I'm not an alum, I do regret that I never considered applying to this school. The only thing I knew about Wabash was that it didn't allow girls to come here, obviously, right? And joke is on me because I ended up in seminary, which is an all-boys school too, so. But I regret it because this is a really amazing school, and I know I would have benefited from it greatly. Anyway, I want to reiterate my gratitude to the Sphinx Club, again, for keeping the traditions of this college alive, especially this hallowed chapel talk tradition. My chapel talk today, in fact, is inspired by a chapel talk I attended earlier this year. The chapel talk I attended was given by 2 members of Shout and was entitled, A Call for Assassins. Although the talk was not explicitly focused on masculinity, it was related to the topic in a roundabout way. And while, of course, whenever we hear speech, we rarely agree with everything that was shared, nor did I agree with everything that was shared in that talk, I was nonetheless very grateful to the speakers. It takes a lot of guts to get up here, to be vulnerable with your brothers, and especially to talk about something controversial and personal. Their talk also challenged me to re-examine my own understanding of masculinity, which is why I chose to make that the topic of today's chapel talk. And before I share my thoughts on authentic masculinity, I do want to preface by saying I don't claim to be an expert, right? Nor do I claim to be a pro, right? None of us are. All of us fall short at times. Nevertheless, I believe that all of us are called to authentic masculinity, and in fact, we all long for it. No matter what our race is, our religion, or our lifestyle preferences. Similarly, I want to acknowledge that masculinity is often understood in a shallow or toxic way, which is why it is seen by many as controversial. But it is my belief that we need to look past the shallow versions of masculinity and return to authentic masculinity. Many of us got initiated into a shallow or toxic version of masculinity around the time we entered our high school years. It's the kind of masculinity portrayed in many locker rooms, parties, and Hollywood movies and sitcoms. Its message about masculinity is that men are lazy and comical. They treat sex casually. They take pride in being able to outdrink their friends. They make crude jokes, and they focus most of their time on things that ultimately don't last. Things like television or video games. My high school experience was no different. I rarely thought about my future, about my purpose in life, or how I could make myself a better man. I was also a devout sports fan and spent hours researching my favorite teams, often to the neglect of some of my other responsibilities. I still love watching and playing sports, but I've learned to moderate this passion. Right? One of the examples for me in this is Coach Vince Lombardi. How many of you heard of Coach Vince Lombardi? Hopefully all of you, right? Perhaps the greatest coach in history, right? Not only in football, but he started his career as a basketball coach. Many people don't realize that. He wasn't even a basketball player, but he just had this gift for coaching, right? And Coach Lombardi, of course, despite being, maybe the greatest coach of all time, right, he always reminded his players that their priorities needed to be faith first, then their family, and only then football. Right? His priority is correct. A lot of people don't realize that Coach Lombardi was very devout in his Christian faith, and in fact, he was a devout Catholic. And he used to tell his players that he would go to church every single morning at 6 a.m. Right? He would go to church. And of course, if you know anything about Coach Lombardi, right, he was pretty rough and gruff, right, on the field. And so some of his players, they kind of questioned whether or not he was telling the truth. And so one of his players actually decided to test it one day, and he showed up to the church at 6 a.m. for the Mass. Right? So he got there 15 minutes beforehand, 5:45 in the morning, and of course, Coach Lombardi wasn't there. And the player thought to himself, he's always early. Where's Coach Lombardi? Right? And he kept checking his watch, and he noticed as the time was ticking by, and Coach Lombardi was nowhere to be seen. And the guy thought, is this for real? Has he been lying this whole time? And of course, when he looked down at his watch, it was 6:01. Right? Coach Lombardi was officially late. And just as this player was about to walk out of the church, the bell rang, and out came the priest from the sacristy. But first, Coach Lombardi as the altar server, been hiding in the sacristy. Right? So anyway, he's always been a model to me about keeping our priorities in check, especially when it comes to sports. But I digress. Right? What I'm trying to say is that in my younger years, I was not pursuing authentic masculinity, but I was mainly just focused on myself and having fun. That is, until I met someone who challenged me to something more. Father Brian Dorr was assigned to my church when I was a junior in high school, and to give you an idea, he was about 6'5", built like a linebacker, probably 250 pounds. Right? He was intelligent, he was articulate, he was charismatic and funny. And just being in his presence was kind of intimidating, right? Kind of like being in Coach Morrell's presence, right? Intimidating personality, a strong personality, right? Some of you here might even know Father Dorr. But anyway, although Father Dorr was very masculine, what surprised me about him is that he wasn't like other men because he didn't fit any of the typical versions of masculinity I was accustomed to. For example, he didn't share a lot of the typical masculine hobbies. He wasn't a hunter. Right? He didn't watch or play sports. He didn't know how to build a house or work on cars. Right? He didn't spend hours in the gym lifting weights. He didn't make crude jokes. And even though he drank alcohol, he never got drunk. Right? Perhaps most significantly, he didn't talk like other men did, especially women, especially about women. For example, when I told him I had a girlfriend, he said, "Do you realize that she will be somebody else's wife someday? Better treat her with respect." Yeah, exactly. That was basically my response. Okay. No one had ever spoken to me like that before, but I never forgot it. And brothers, now that I'm a priest, I realize he was right to caution me. Right? One of the unique experiences of being a priest is that people come to us in the sacrament of confession, right? And they tell us about their mistakes and their sins, and they share things with us they don't share with other people. And I can't speak for the experience of women everywhere, but I can only share my experience from that. Right? And brothers, it's difficult to overstate just how common it is for young women to come to the confessional absolutely devastated because they become sexually active. They feel like they lost a central piece of themselves, and it's usually followed by them telling me that they're tempted to take their own life because of their shame. And brothers, I think if you and I are honest, I think we can recognize that it causes great shame in us as well. The point is that Father Dorr showed me that authentic masculinity is not reducible to any of the typical traits associated with men. It goes beyond those things to something much deeper. And when it is understood correctly and pursued, authentic masculinity becomes a gift to us and to others. So what does it look like? I'd like to highlight 3 attributes that Father Dorr taught me about authentic masculinity. It consists of magnanimity, reverence or gratitude, and the use of our power to serve others. The first attribute is magnanimity. What is magnanimity? It comes from two Latin words, magna, meaning great, and anima, meaning soul. Those of you who are classic majors, you know this. Right? In other words, magnanimity means greatness of soul. The magnanimous man pursues great things and strives to make himself great. He disciplines himself in virtue and the pursuit of wisdom so he can become a great leader. A magnanimous man does not have time to waste on small-minded projects or small-minded people, but only focuses on the most important things, and especially on becoming a leader. I believe God designed men to be leaders. So a man who is not magnanimous, who doesn't strive for greatness and wisdom and virtue, who's not becoming a strong leader, is someone who is simply wasting his masculinity. He may look like a man, but without magnanimity, he's still just a boy. Father Dorr used to remind us of how important our role in the world was. He would say, never underestimate the power you have to influence others. You know, I remember one time in particular, I was telling Father Dorr about a recent comedy movie I saw in theaters. I won't share what it is, lest I scandalize anybody, right? But I was telling him about this movie, and I was telling him how funny it was and how he needed to go see it. And I'll never forget how he responded. He listened to me. He paused for a while, and he paused a little longer until I felt really awkward. And then he said, Michael, do you think I have time to watch movies like that? Of course, it made me feel pretty dumb. But again, I appreciated what he said. He was right. He wasn't saying that there's anything wrong with watching movies. He was just making the point that many of us, we waste far too much time on things that don't ultimately matter. It was shortly after this that I decided to stop playing video games, right? After thinking about what he said. And it wasn't an easy decision. Anybody here play Madden NFL, right? I kind of had a reputation in my friend groups. Never lost a game at Madden, right? And I'd spend hours and hours playing this game, right? Until one day I was reflecting on what Father Dorr said, and I realized that, I could have all those accomplishments and be so successful in that game, right? But what difference does it make? Does anybody actually care about any of those accomplishments in that make-believe world? It's just a fantasy. It's a waste of time. Right? So I cut out video games from my life, and I started focusing on things that helped me become a better man and developing skills. I started working out more regularly. I started taking my schoolwork seriously, and I actually started to read books, right? Even ones I wasn't assigned. Right? I read books on history, politics, and religion because I wanted to be wise and knowledgeable. I started learning languages and how to play musical instruments. I re-examined who I spent time with. Father Dorr always reminded us that if we hang around with mediocre men, then we'll remain mediocre men. But if we hang with men who are more virtuous and wise than we are, then some of that will rub off on us. As the scriptures say, iron sharpens iron. So I stopped spending so much time with my fun-loving buddies, and I started to spend more time with the guys who challenged me. The second attribute of authentic masculinity he taught me is reverence, otherwise known as gratitude. The word reverence comes from a Latin word meaning to stand in awe. So reverence means that we stand in awe of the world around us and what has been given to us. We're men of gratitude. We recognize that everything we have in life is a gift from someone else and recognize that we are little giants who stand on the shoulders of the giants who came before us. Reverence also means that we revere the dignity of every person around us, so we don't resort to derogatory speech or mockery toward people when they annoy us or wrong us. As I mentioned, Father Dorr was always very careful with his words. He believed that making derogatory jokes or belittling people was actually a perversion of masculinity. Instead, he taught me how to affirm and show honor. Brothers, our words carry great weight. Just think about the times in your life that a man has belittled you or made you feel weak. Those words can be devastating. But when men use words that build others up, it can be life-changing. And that brings me, brothers, to the last attribute that Father Dorr taught me about authentic masculinity. Authentic masculinity means that we use our power for the service of others. He used to teach us this by giving us examples from history. One of his favorites is our state's very own Chief Tecumseh. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with some of the basic details of Tecumseh's life, but for those of you who aren't, you should. He's an amazing man. He lived at the turn of the 1800s when the conflict between the American pioneers and the Native Americans in the Midwest was at its worst, right? Just before the founding of this hallowed school. And like other chiefs, Chief Tecumseh earned respect because of his reputation in battle, but Tecumseh was unique because he recognized that his leadership was about more than just courage in battle. It was also about wisdom. For example, Chief Tecumseh, he recognized that alcoholism was a major problem in his tribe, and so he never even touched it. He saw how weak and aimless it was making his peers, and he pleaded with them to avoid becoming slaves to it. Tecumseh also valued education. Many of the Native Americans who he hung around with despised the learning the pioneers possessed. But Tecumseh saw the value in it, and he strove to educate himself. In fact, many of the Indians marveled at his ability to predict things about the future, like the stars and the weather. Right? Some of them thought he was a prophet, but he'd actually just taken the time to learn science from the pioneers who were willing to teach him. Finally, the last thing that Tecumseh did to distinguish himself was that he was always focused on uniting the Native Americans against their common enemy. The Indian tribes often struggled because not only did they have to defend themselves against the pioneers, but they were also regularly at war with one another. Tecumseh knew he had to find a way to unite all the tribes together, and he desperately tried to get his fellow Indians to understand what was coming. He tried to tell them if they did not unite, they would lose everything. And one of the analogies he used to use was he would take a stick and he would break it over his knee, right, with ease. Right? And then he would grab a whole bundle of sticks and tie them together, right? And he would try to break it over his knee, and he would show how impossible it was. And then he would tell the chief, he would say, each tribe is like one stick, and it will be easily broken. But if we unite, then they will never be able to break us. And Tecumseh went on campaign for months, traveling the Midwest with the same message, right? Going to tribe after tribe, chief after chief. Right? But unfortunately for him, as he was finishing up his campaign and had not yet returned, his brother foolishly initiated the crushing battle at Prophetstown. Right? You can still go to Prophetstown today. Right? And this battle all but sealed the fate of Tecumseh and his people. And you and I know how the rest of the story ended. Needless to say, Tecumseh was an amazing man, but there is one story of Tecumseh that speaks to me above the rest. It's about how he became Chief Tecumseh when he was only 15 years old. Right? Imagine what you were doing when you were 15, right? He became the chief. When he was 15 years old, he had already earned the respect of his tribe in battle and was even revered by some of the older men of the tribe. And one night, after one particular victory, some of his fellow warriors spent an entire night torturing one of the pioneers that they had captured. Tecumseh did not participate, but instead he sat a few yards away, facing the other direction, as his peers mercilessly tortured and mocked the man all through the night. Tecumseh didn't sleep for 1 minute, but instead sat in silence with his back to the men. When morning came and the man finally died, after so many hours of agony and torture, Tecumseh stood up and he faced the men who had done it and said, "That is the most pathetic use of power. It was a disgrace. And any man who participated can never be my friend. I cannot endure one more minute in your presence, and I'm leaving." And he left. It was at that moment that he left the tribe and started his own. And some members of the tribe were so convicted by his example, they left that tribe and they joined his. That's how he became Chief Tecumseh. Brothers, I find this story inspirational and moving because authentic masculinity means that we use our power for good and never for evil. We always show restraint and mercy on those who are vulnerable and weak. We use our power to serve others, not to dominate or take advantage of them. When men are magnanimous and strong like Tecumseh, they have tremendous power, and God designed us to be strong in that way. Toxic masculinity is when men use their strength for their own self-interest or to harm others. And Tecumseh never forgot that his power was for good and not for evil. Whenever Father Dorr would observe me or one of my peers acting dishonorably, he would remind us of stories like this, and he would ask us, "Is that how you're going to use your power?" And brothers, that's the question I wish to leave with you as well. How are you going to use the power that God has given you? Will you use your power to serve? Or worse, will you just let it go to waste? I believe that the desire for authentic masculinity is written on each of our hearts. And although we make mistakes and fall short, we all truly want to be men like Tecumseh, like Coach Lombardi, or like Father Dorr. We want to be the kind of men who challenge others to be better, who always resist evil and show mercy. We want to be men who are wise and build up the ones we love. We want to be the kind of men that our future children are proud of, our spouses admire, and our peers respect. So let us never settle for shallow forms of masculinity, but for authentic masculinity. The kind of authentic masculinity which is magnanimous, which is reverent, and that always puts its power at the service of others. Thank you.
A few final announcements. At 12 o'clock on Saturday, baseball will be facing Illinois Wesleyan. At 2 o'clock on Saturday, the lacrosse team will face Kenyon. And last but certainly not least, La Alianza's Spring Festival fundraiser will be hosted next Friday at Mud Hollow in collaboration with the Malcolm X Institute of Black Studies, the Sphinx Club, and other clubs on campus such as the DJ Club, Pipe and Cigar Club, and many more. There will be a 5v5 soccer tournament with a $500 prize pool, so get your teams in by next Thursday night at the latest. I want to thank you all for attending. Now will you all please rise and join in singing Old Wabash. From the hills of